As Christians, we have a general concern for the truth, and as friends of Israel, we have a particular concern for the truth about Israel. That concern has become much greater over the last 2 years, as many distortions and deceptions have been spread about both the state of Israel and the land of Israel. Consequently, along with many others, we now find ourselves greatly concerned for truth at the BBC, the UK's flagship media organisation. In 2022, the BBC reported that its international news services reached 456 million people around the world every week, more than any other international broadcaster. So the reports it posts and broadcasts have a massive influence around the world. And the BBC has long been regarded as a global standard for impartial journalism. But now, through the Telegraph's publication of an internal memo, it faces intense criticism over its coverage of US President Donald Trump, racial diversity, gender issues in society, and Israel's war against terrorists and other enemies. In this video, we examine the latter criticism and consider the question of whether the BBC News Group can actually change so as to uphold its commitment to impartial reporting. From the outset of Israel's war with Hamas, the BBC refused to call Hamas terrorists, even deploying their World Affairs editor John Simpson to defend that decision.
They're all asking why the BBC doesn't say that the Hamas gunmen who carried out the appalling atrocities in southern Israel are terrorists. The answer goes right back to the BBC's founding principles. Terrorism is a loaded word which people use about an outfit they disapprove of morally. It's simply not the BBC's job to tell people who to support and who to condemn, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys.
Then on the 17th of October 2023, the BBC reported on their news website live feed that a hospital in Gaza had been hit. It was an explosion and fire at the Ali Hospital, covered by their correspondent John Donnison live on air.
The Israeli military has been contacted for comment, and they have said that they are investigating. But, it is hard to see what else this could be, really, given the size of the explosion, other than an Israeli airstrike or several airstrikes.
While it only took hours for the Israelis to deny responsibility and produce evidence of a terrorist rocket veering off course, days afterward BBC Verify was still not prepared to let go of the possibility of Israeli responsibility. The BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen, had also reported live on the incident, and more than a month later he was asked on the BBC's Behind the Stories programme about getting it wrong.
I've got to ask you about the hospital on the 17th of October.
Al-Akli, yeah.
The BBC was criticised heavily for its reporting of that event. Tell us what happened that night and, bluntly, where were you getting your information, and do you regret anything that you said that night?
So it broke in, I suppose, mid-evening. And to answer your question, no, I don't regret one thing in my reporting, because I think I was measured throughout. I didn't race to judgment.
But you said that building had been flattened.
He was completely unapologetic for misleading millions of viewers and doing significant damage to Israel's reputation. Another problem listed in that internal memo reported by the Telegraph related to mass graves that were discovered at 2 Gaza hospitals in 2024, as described here by the Telegraph's Gordon Rayner.
In April and June 2024, the BBC published 2 stories about the discovery of mass graves at Al-Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals in Gaza. According to the internal BBC dossier, the articles strongly implied that Israeli forces had buried bodies at both sites prior to withdrawing from the area. The articles also mentioned alleged evidence of war crimes, including bodies found with their hands tied and gunshot wounds to their heads. But the BBC's own Editorial Standards Committee was told that this narrative was wrong. The memo says that the most likely explanation is that the mass graves were dug by Palestinians themselves and the people buried there had died or been killed prior to the arrival of the Israeli ground forces. So, the BBC made a mistake. Well, perhaps. But the committee argues that the broadcaster knew that Palestinians were burying their dead at these sites before the Israeli raids. Several months earlier, the BBC itself reported on Palestinians digging mass graves, and geolocation clearly places the two burial sites in roughly the same area. Now, whatever your personal views may be on the actions of Israel in Gaza, implying a country committed war crimes when there is evidence to the contrary has serious ramifications.
In addition to these examples, there was the most serious accusation levelled against Israel, that of committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. The BBC repeatedly reported that the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, had ruled in January 2024 that there was a plausible case of genocide in Gaza. It was mentioned by Jeremy Bowen, among others, and on Newsnight, as well as various television and radio reports. But Joan Donoghue, former president of the ICJ, told the BBC's Hard Talk programme that the media had widely misinterpreted its findings.
You know, I'm glad I have a chance to address that, because the court's test for deciding whether to impose measures uses the idea of plausibility, but the test is the plausibility of the rights that are asserted by the applicant, in this case, South Africa. So the court decided that the Palestinians had a plausible right to be protected from genocide, and that South Africa had the right to present that claim in the court. It then looked at the facts as well, but it did not decide, and this is something where I'm correcting what's often said in the media, it didn't decide that the claim of genocide was plausible.
An internal BBC review into the matter found that the ICJ's ruling is very clear and explicitly states that the court is not making any determination on the merits of claims of genocide, but it took months for the BBC to issue a correction. And even after that correction, Hadar Selah, co-editor of Camera UK, revealed in conversation with Jonathan Sassodotti that the BBC included the same error in another 7 reports through the rest of the year. The leaked internal memo went on to say that allegations made against Israel were raced to air without adequate checks, suggesting either carelessness or a desire always to believe the worst about Israel. These are just 4 of the major mistakes made by the BBC in its reporting about the conflict. There were many more. When the Telegraph published the internal BBC memo on the 3rd of November 2025, there was a surge of concern about the inaccuracies detailed in the BBC's reporting. Some former BBC employees, like Suzanne Evans, expressed the opinion that the problem is groupthink within the corporation.
I think it's also because, and I'm sorry to say it, but I have some former colleagues I worked with, and I can see just today that they are subsumed by this kind of left-wing agenda. They just don't see things in an objective way, and it's not just incidents like this when the BBC has a kind of anti-Trump agenda, so thinks that everybody else shares their view. It's a kind of like corporate groupthink, really.
Pressure upon the corporation built up through the week, until the Director General and the Chief Executive Officer of BBC News both submitted their resignations 6 days later. And yet, they both defended their news team.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News and to work with our brilliant team of journalists. I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider. And if you'll excuse me,
why did you fail to deal with the mistakes that were made?
And see my teams. Thank you so much for being
here.
Morning, everyone. Good morning. Just want to say a couple of things. I'm here to lead and support the BBC. I'm very, very proud of our journalists in this building. They're doing work, I think, that's incredibly important. I want to thank every one of them. They're doing a wonderful job. Also, everyone across the BBC doing their thing for the UK, and personally, I'm here to lead and support them. The BBC's going to be thriving, and I support every one of the team. I'm very proud of them. Thank you very much, everyone. Great.
In the light of those two statements, there seems to be little chance of the BBC's senior management accepting that the news team is biased in its reporting on Israel. And now most of the attention is focused upon the dispute with Donald Trump, who has threatened to sue the BBC. So the bias against Israel may be overlooked. However, a BBC Verify report by Ross Atkins admitted that the BBC was already under pressure before the leak of the internal memo, having mentioned a Gaza documentary that had to be withdrawn because of links to Hamas, and the broadcast of Bob Villan's anti-Israel chant at Glastonbury. He went on to say,
and so, while the edit of Trump's speech is serious, the broader allegation is that there's something more here, something systemic, something about this leadership and the BBC as a whole. In his memo, Michael Prescott argued, on no other occasion in my professional life have I witnessed what I did at the BBC with regard to how management dealt with or failed to deal with serious recurrent problems.
There is a serious question as to whether there is a realistic chance of reform within the BBC's news team, despite the catalogue of evidence about its long-standing bias. Is the BBC so entrenched in groupthink that it will fight all attempts at reform so as to continue its biased reporting? Let's give Natasha Hausdorff, International Law Specialist and Legal Director of UK Lawyers for Israel, the last word for now.
It's incumbent upon all of us to highlight these issues, not to let them be papered over. You know, there's a suggestion, and indeed you raised it in your questions, that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness have ultimately been forced to resign because of the way in which the video of President Trump was manipulated. But importantly, all of these problems, all of this false reporting, demonstrably false reporting with respect to Israel, cannot be forgotten because as a result of this tendency, as this whistleblower has said, to rush these stories to air out of carelessness or a desire to always believe the worst about Israel. I mean, that very much appears to be something that is pervasive throughout the BBC and its reporters, and that will require an awful lot of work to address, if it can be addressed at all.